Okay, wonderful. Great to hear you chatting and catching up. But let's turn to God's word together, if I can grab your attention. Wonderful. If you have a Bible, you might like to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8 is where we're going to be this morning as we continue our series in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel. And this morning we begin to talk about kings. And so if we're talking about kings, where best to begin but with the words of Simba, the lion cub who would be the Lion King, who sang with excited expectancy, "Oh, I just can't wait to be king," because he could do what he wanted, he could live how he wanted, no one to tell him to do this or be here or stop that, free to run around all day and do it all his way. He would be the master of his fate, the captain of his soul. And the world tells us it's good to have such power and freedom. It's good to be king. Well, we come to 1 Samuel chapter 8, and let's set the scene a little. The people of God are led by judges. These are leaders who are raised up by God to lead the nation under his law and under his direction. There were good judges, and there were not so good judges. But this was very different to other nations at the time, because most of the nations and the people who surrounded them were led by kings. And in this day and age, they were men who stood as rulers with all authority and all power. They didn't have to and very rarely consulted. They did not answer to God nor man. They led as they saw fit and did what they deemed right. You see, the judges were called to answer to God and called to answer to the people of God in the way that they led. But kings answered to no one. And God's plan, it seemed, was that one day he would redeem the model of monarchy. He would set a king over his people. But that king would be raised up by him in his timing. And so Moses looks ahead to this coming king in the book of Deuteronomy. He says, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and you dwell in it, and then you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. And Moses goes on to say that this king will be one who loves the law, who honors God and his people, and leads with justice and righteousness. And I point this out to say that God is not opposed to kings ruling over his people, but he will choose the king, because he is the one who knows the heart of the king. He is the one who gives such a king for such a time, for the right purpose, and for the good of his people. And yet, as we move into chapter 8, we find the people of God are restless with God's rule. And they're eager to move things on in their own timing. And they will cry out, God, we've heard your plan, but we think we know better. And we've seen how the other nations do it, and we'd like to give that a try. Give us a king, like they have a king, and give us a king now. And that's where we find them, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we'll read the chapter together now. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. And they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly. and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkey he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king that you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." And Samuel said to the Israelites, "Everyone, go back to your own town." So Samuel is old. And the ever-encouraging people of God don't mind reminding him about it. That's how we start. "Samuel," they say, "you're old, and your sons are not good rulers. They are taking what is not theirs, and they are seeking dishonest gain. Power has corrupted them. So the people of God have a better idea, and that is to ask for a king. And quite tellingly, a king like all the other nations." And in those few words, they reveal a lot about their hearts and their minds. Because God had always called his people to be a set-apart people, a distinct people, a people who in their way of living and their way of worshipping stood out among the nations as a people of mercy and justice and love and security. But they were surrounded by nations and peoples who pursued their own glory in their own way. But that was not what was supposed to be the motivation for God's people. God's people were and always should be those who pursue his glory in his way. That is the call on the people of God. They are to be a city on a hill, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, salt and light, set apart for the kingdom of God. But no, as so often before and since, God's people cry out, "We'd rather do it their way than your way. We'd rather do it our way than your way, God." And Samuel is displeased by this response. And I assume there's two reasons. The first is that he's a man who knows God and hears God, and also knows the motives and the hearts of those that he is leading, and know that their hearts are not in line with God's heart. But also, Samuel is displeased because he probably carries some personal pain into his prayers. He's likely aware of how his age has slowed and stalled his leadership. But if we look back in just the last few chapters, even though they were quite a few years ago, we see Samuel as a godly, good, and courageous leader who has led God's people well. And yet now, God's people seem to be rejecting him. However, God makes it clear that that's not what's happening. They're not rejecting Samuel. They're rejecting God. Our actions and the way that we choose to live is not detached from our attitude towards God. When we choose to live in such a way that does not honor, does not listen to the revealed will and word of God, then we are not simply making our own way or doing what's best in our own eyes. We are rejecting God's way. And here, like they have since Egypt, God's people's affections are turning to other gods. Their hearts are bowing to other idols. And so in this moment, God says, give them their king. When Paul in the New Testament writes to the church in Rome, he spends the first chapter painting a relatively bleak picture of the hearts of humanity. And that's because it is a relatively bleak picture. He points the picture of those who have had God revealed to them, but instead of following his will, they turn from it and go their own way. And Paul writes that as they do, God gives them over to the sinful desires of their hearts. God allows them to discover that outside of him there is no fulfillment, that the ways of the world offer no saving and no satisfaction. And in some ways, this moment in 1 Samuel is similar. God gives them over to the way that they have chosen. Give them their king, he says. But warn them. Warn them what it means. Tell them clearly what a king in their image of their choosing will do. How he'll behave. What it will mean for them. And so Samuel warns them in verses 10 through 18. And what we get is this remarkably straightforward but important passage of Scripture that speaks through history of what power looks like when it's put in human hands, of how rulers rule, of how kingdoms in this world get built, of how the strong get stronger off the back of the weak getting weaker, of how power seeks its own good and builds its own future and its own legacy while the people cry out for justice. And while human history has had a spectrum of good leaders and bad, kind kings and cruel, the reality is where human rule is concerned, the commonly heard phrase is not far from true, that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And Psalm 146 declares, do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. God has promised to his people in 1 Samuel again and again that he himself will save his people. He himself will lead his people. And he has shown himself able to do so through split seas and countless victories. He has shown himself to always be the leader that his people need. Yet even after Samuel's warning, the people cry, no. Even after all God has done through generations, they say, our way, please. And as the reader, we can respond, oh, come on. How can they make this mistake again and again? How can God's people turn from him again and again? Yet too often, we can't see ourselves in this. But I am convinced that we can be quite similar. We can too often turn to our own strength, our own understanding, temporary pleasures to seek security and satisfaction when the word has made it clear that we cannot trust in these things. I cannot trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. And all the treasures that we build up on earth are just food for moth and rust. Too often we can negate the call to be a distinct people of God, set apart, salt and light. And instead of longing to display God's glory to the world, we can cry out loudly or internally, I'd quite like to just be like everyone else, God. We too can live like the king of our own lives and reject the king of all creation. We can find solace or even excitement in the idea that no one is saying, do this, or stop that, or be here. Indeed, our culture might say that self-sufficiency is a great freedom, but I believe it to be a great danger. And the great danger is not that in walking our own way we displease an angry God, or that we fall out of his favor, or that we put more negative counters in the column on high. The great danger is that we deny God's kind, generous, and gracious warning and encouragement to see that only life under his rule can be life and life to the full. And he has invited us in to know such life. He does not invite us under his kingship out of a desire that we are constrained or contracted, but in a desire that we would be released from the futility of life without God into the freedom of life with God. To live with him as king is to know freedom, not futility. It's to know peace and purpose, not chaos and confusion. To make Jesus king is to stand radically opposed to a culture that says it's good to be king, and choose instead to follow the one and only king who doesn't just do good, but is good in everything. And it's good perhaps for us to consider in what ways and moments we might be tempted in our lives to take Jesus off the throne and put something or someone else there instead. In what ways we might be tempted to try and wear the crown of our life. What are some ways in which we might do that? Well, let's consider the people of God's primary motivation here in Samuel, it seems. They say, we want a king to lead us into battle. We want to go into battle in our own strength, not God's. Well, that is a devastating mistake. Because we have seen in only the last few chapters that every time God's people have led themselves into battle, they have been defeated. Only when they have allowed God to lead them have they been victorious. In fact, God has used the most bizarre and unexpected ways to bring about victory for God's people. He's used cows and carts, thunder and confusion to bring about unprecedented victories. Yet now his people seem to say, we'd rather do it the world's way than the peculiar way of God, even though the peculiar way of God is the only way that they have ever seen victory. Now, we too will face battles in our life. We probably won't face the same kind of battle that Samuel and the people of God were facing. We probably won't face armies, but we will face trials. We will face seasons of sickness and grief. We will face diagnoses that come without answers. We'll face relationships that fail and disappoint us. We'll face walls that seem unscalable. We'll face families that fight. We'll face judgments that don't go our way. And at times, we will all walk through what seems like the valley of the shadow of death. And we will be tempted to fight like the world, to fight in our own strength, to seek personal victory, to take vengeance, to use bitter words or harsh lies or whatever we can get hold of, to seek temporary refuge in temporary satisfactions when God offers us eternal security. We will be tempted in our battles to hide or to fight ugly and win quickly. But in the dark valley, we have a good shepherd, one who is with us, one whose rod and staff comfort us, one who prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies. And this good shepherd is the good shepherd who wins the battle in the most unprecedented and unexpected ways. He's the good shepherd who split the sea and who stopped the sun in the sky and who closed the lions' mouths. And surely this good shepherd's goodness and mercy will follow you all the days of your life. And into every battle in your life, and into every trial in your life, if you go in your own strength, victory is far from assured. But if we step into it with him, he will lead us in unexpected, yes, unprecedented, yes, ways that sometimes seem like victory is far away, yes, but always in goodness, always in mercy, always with a rod and staff that comforts us. We walk into our battles with the God of angel armies on our side. Another way that we can take the throne in our life is in the area of satisfaction and fulfillment. We store up treasures on earth, forgetting that moth and rust destroy. The cry of the world so often is that freedom can only be found outside of any form of external authority. That true liberation is found in self-sufficiency. But that is a myth. That is a folly. There is no worldly king or structure or system that can satisfy the deep longings of your soul when the storms come. They are all houses that are built on sand. Bank balances fail. Reputation and human affection is fickle. Health fails you. Beauty fades. Friends and families disappoint. Human heroes fail us. And if you build your life on the words of others, then I can assure you what you will find is that even the greatest compliments that you receive fall into insignificance when you receive even the smallest criticism. If you pursue satisfaction and fulfillment in the things of this world, the ways of other peoples and nations, then you will discover nothing but stuff that moth and rust destroy. All the while, Christ invites you to live in such a way that builds up treasures in heaven. Christ invites you to a life that may look small in the eyes of the world, but is life and life to the full with him. Another way that we try to take the throne is in the area of identity, believing that our value is found in the cultures and values and tribes and titles that the world can offer us. We can be too quick to define ourselves in worldly ways, to seek solace in knowing that we are just like the other nations and the other peoples. We can believe that by doing so, if I'm just like the other nations, if I'm just like the other peoples, that we purchase some sort of ticket into a group or a culture in which we'll always be accepted and always be loved and never be challenged. But what we discover is that if we wrap up our identity in our job or our class or our last name or our nationality or our sexuality, we get wrapped up in trying to find value in and of ourselves when only true and lasting value can be found in knowing that we are loved by the God of the universe. And he has invited us in to be known, not by the temporary titles of this world, but known as a child of God, now and forevermore. You see, the kings and ways of this world cannot save, and they cannot satisfy, and they cannot fulfill the deep longing in every heart to be known, to be loved, to be accepted. And it is the kindness of God. It is the kindness of him that reveals this truth to us, that loves us far too much to leave us outside of his rule, where so-called freedom only enslaves, entraps, and leaves us empty. In love, God draws us in to know that there is a king who can save. There is a king who can satisfy. There is a king who has made a way for us to be loved and accepted and forever safe under his glorious rule. If we go back to Samuel, God gives the people the king that they've asked for. They get Saul, and he was not the king that God had chosen. He was not the king that Moses had looked ahead to. He did all that Samuel predicted and more. While at times he honored God, he often pursued his own plans and his own glory. After him, God raised up another king, the king who was planned, David, a man whose life we will go into great depth to understand over the coming weeks. He was a man who loved the law like Moses foresaw. He was a man who was after God's heart. He unified the people of God under God's presence and purposes, yet too, he was just a man. Far from perfect. He took his eyes off God and he wandered his own way. He was a king who did some good, but ultimately he was pointing ahead to a true and better and good, complete king. Because around 1,000 years later, a child would be born one in the line of David, one as the great carol, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus declares, one born a child and yet a king. Jesus, the Son of God, the better David, the true king, came into this world to fully redeem kingship. He is, as Paul puts it, one who was in the form of God but did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. This is our King, who came not to take advantage for his own glory, not to pursue strength at the expense of the weak, and not to build temples to keep people out, but to tear the temple curtain in two and invite us in. This is the true King who comes to embrace, not exclude. The true King who invites us to know him and follow him and love him, not as some form of egotistical power grab, but mercifully and humbly and intimately and self-sacrificially. Our King makes a way for us to find complete freedom under his loving rule. You see, our King comes not to take, but to give. He says, come all who are weary. Weary of being your own king. Weary of putting your trust in princes who only disappoint. Weary of fighting your own battles. Weary of storing up treasures on earth. Weary of feeling unsatisfied. Weary of seeking value in yourself and others. Come all who are weary, and he will give you rest. If you have been fighting your own battles, relying on the world's strength and the wisdom of the world to overcome the odds, but you just find a new enemy around every corner, then come to the King who has demonstrated his power in the fact that he has defeated even death for you. And he's promised you peace in the midst of every storm. If you find yourself scrambling for self-satisfaction, seeking fulfillment in the temporary things of this world, but you find at the end of each one an empty feeling, you've been so busy comparing yourself to so many, desperate to reach the next level or to have the same stuff or to look the right way, come to the King who offers you a joy rooted not in what you have and what you've done, but in what he has done and what he has for you. And if you've been seeking and yearning for identity in anything that might bring you value, and you've trialed the things and the titles of this world, but you've found them lacking, and you've looked for acceptance in every crowd, but you've grown tired of trying to look like everyone else, know that God has a higher calling for you, to be a child of the living God, to find purpose in the pursuit of holiness, to find love that is poured into your heart, to find in Jesus a better King and a better way. I'd love us to come back to worship. Tim, perhaps you guys could come and begin to lead us. As we consider the cry of the people in 1 Samuel, give us a king, we must consider where we cry the same thing. We must consider where we look to ourselves as king or look to other things as king, and we instead must turn to Jesus. Because he says, come all who are weary, and I will give you rest. Because he is not like earthly kings. He is gentle, and he is lowly in heart. He's not a king on the take. He's not a king looking to overpower. He's the one and only king who laid aside his majesty, who gives and gives and gives again. That when we find ourselves recognizing in our own lives that we've taken Jesus off the throne of whatever area it might be, when we realize that we're yearning for something in our own strength or in our own wisdom or in our own treasures, and we come back to him and we say, King Jesus, I'm coming back to you. He never turns us away because he gives of himself again and again and again. He gave of his very blood. He gave of his very body, so that we know that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. We know that however we find ourselves this morning, whether we find ourselves as those who have never turned to Jesus as King, and you find yourself fighting battles or yearning for satisfaction, and you're in this place and you know that you haven't found it, then you can come to him today. You don't have to do anything to earn it because he has paid the price. Or if you find yourself like me, a follower of Jesus who far too often puts myself on the throne, recognizing that I'm stepping into battles in my own strength, recognizing that I'm scrambling for satisfaction in the things of this world, then I can come back to King Jesus, who is always kind and always gracious, and puts into perspective again the battles and trials and things that I face, and invites me and invites you to come and know that he is always good. And our response is worship. Singing, yeah. King Jesus, yeah. Who was obedient to death, even death on a cross, and therefore God has exalted him to the highest place, that at his name every knee should bow and every tongue confess. Yes, worship. But also worship like our bodies as a living sacrifice. Worship. Like every day I want to honor him. Every day I want to put him first. Every day I want to go after him, because going after him is life and life to the full. Going after him is joy unabounding. Going after him is the place in which we find all that we've been made to be.